There have only been two instances of modern bioterrorism in the United States. In 1984, in a small town in Oregon, there was a cult. This is just like such a weird story. There was a cult, and they wanted to control local elections. They wanted to literally they wanted to influence the city council. So they put salmonella on a salad bar. 700 or so people got sick, but nobody died. And they did not win the elections. So, that was failed. In 2001, most of you probably don't remember this, but if you're a little bit older, you might. Immediately following the attacks on September 11th, there were letters containing anthrax that were mailed to various senators and news outlets. So, of course, everybody freaked out because we had all just watched live television of planes crashing into buildings and buildings collapsing, and we saw thousands of people die on live television, and now there's anthrax being sent in the mail. It was a really scary time. This was right before I turned 18, so I remember this pretty well, going, well, my adulthood is going to be pretty messed up, and it's been pretty messed up following these types of attacks. So where was anthrax eventually found? In a number of different locations. Kansas City, Missouri, there were spores found in a postal facility. Indianapolis, there were spores. New York City, 4 confirmed cases, 1 death. New Jersey, 5 cases. DC, 3 cases and 2 deaths. Boca Raton, Florida, 1 confirmed case, 1 death. So this, again, was a really scary time. And it turned out that even though the person wrote the letters as if they were from a foreign terrorist group, it ended up being domestic terrorism. It was a US-based scientist who did this. So what is anthrax? Anthrax is a toxin produced by a bacterium called Bacillus anthracis. It's one of the major biowarfare agents. Every group that was studying biowarfare studied anthrax. Research in lots of different countries. It's attractive because it's easy to grow, and it's really hard to kill because it will form spores, and those spores can be dried out, they can be heated up, and they'll still survive. There are 3 manifestations of disease. GI, if you happen to ingest the spores. Cutaneous, which we can see here. This is like a wound that got spores in it. And then inhalation. So that's what happened when the spores were sent in the mail. People would open up the mail, or powder would fall out of the mail, and it would get inhaled, and then the spores would get into the lungs. They would germinate, and the bacteria produce the toxin. I mentioned it already, an accidental release in Russia, well, the former Soviet Union, killed about 100 people. We do have a vaccine. It is given to soldiers because they are most at risk. So what anthrax does, let's say we're talking about inhaled, which is the most common form of terroristic anthrax release. The spores are inhaled, they get into the lungs. The white blood cells attack the spores, but really aren't able to kill them. The spores will then collect in the lymph nodes and develop. If a patient is vaccinated, this is when they would fight it off. And then as the bacteria develop, they begin to produce toxins. The toxins spread throughout the rest of the body, and there's 2 toxins that anthrax produces. One is called edema toxin. It causes fluid loss and swelling. The other is called lethal toxin that kills your cells. So you get severe internal bleeding, damage to tissue of major organs. Antibiotics won't work because the toxin is already circulating. Another real common organism thought of as a potential bioweapon was tularemia. Again, because of the aerosolized form. We've talked about Francisella tularensis already. It can be transmitted by ticks or as an aerosol. So the aerosol form would be the form that we would consider as the terroristic potential. Of course, it's named after where it was first discovered in Tulare County. Symptoms can include lesion if the bacteria get into the skin, but if they get into the rest of the body, fever and sepsis. Generally, death would be caused by multiple organ failure, especially if it's the inhaled version, and it lives in those macrophages that are designed to kill it. So that's why it has strong potential use as a bioweapon. Yersinia pestis, which causes plague, was one of the first bioweapons. I told you about flinging plague corpses over walls. The Japanese developed the flea bombs during World War II. The Soviets did a lot of work, and the Soviets, to this day, have been pretty secretive about what they did. We know some things, but not all. We usually know what we know because of spies or defectors, but they've done genetic manipulation, combining some of the more dangerous features of multiple diseases into one. And we know that that aerosolized form, remember, is most dangerous because it's more likely to be spread person to person. And the mortality rate is pretty high and death comes pretty rapidly. Now, the downside, of course, to using something like plague is that plague can be treated with antibiotics. So as soon as people figured out what it was, you'd be able to prescribe antibiotics and hopefully treat most people. So here's our mortality rate. The bubonic plague is about 50%. Pneumonic plague is 90%. And once it spreads, it's almost 100% mortality. So that's why, again, it's fairly attractive. And the last potential bioweapon that a number of countries were working on, and again, they say they weren't, but they were, was smallpox. So in the early history of colonization in the US, this was used as a bioweapon. During World War II, a lot of countries worked on weaponizing it, but because of already in place widespread vaccination, so during World War II, we're talking late 30s, early 40s, things like smallpox had been almost eliminated from the US already because everybody was vaccinated. And so the parts of the world that still weren't vaccinated were not necessarily the parts of the world that were engaged in World War II either. So in places like Europe and in the US that were heavily involved in the combat, everybody was already vaccinated. So what's the point? So this is why a number of countries decided to really stop looking at smallpox, except of course the USSR, former Soviet Union. They kept doing their research. One of their facilities had an outbreak in the early 70s that killed 3 people. As of right now, there should be only 2 facilities on the entire planet that contain vials of smallpox. And there's been a big debate in the scientific community as to whether or not the 2 countries that are supposed to be the only ones that hold it should destroy it. And because there's a lot of mistrust between these 2 countries, that hasn't happened. So the only 2 places in the entire world that should still have vials of smallpox would be the United States, and it should be in Atlanta at the CDC, and Russia at their facility that's kind of analogous to the CDC called Vector. And of course, I say those should be the only facilities that have smallpox. But a few years ago, they actually found a vial of smallpox at the NIH in Washington, D.C., and it shouldn't have been there. And this is also then assuming that no other countries that were maybe allies, especially of the former Soviet Union, like Iraq or Iran or Afghanistan, that they don't have it. And that if we did all agree to destroy it, that we all would agree to destroy it. So everybody's kind of keeping theirs so that they can, if necessary, go back and start more research into vaccine development. Now, as opposed to during World War II, smallpox might be a more attractive bioweapon because it's easily spread. There are very low vaccination rates. I'm not vaccinated against smallpox. I know a couple people my age who are, that were born in the Middle East because they were still vaccinating into the 80s and 90s. But worldwide, people don't really get vaccinated against smallpox anymore, except for the military. And with the advent of lots of new genetic technology, it's possible to modify the virus even more. So smallpox has kind of made a resurgence, I guess, as a potential bioweapon. And remember, it's not like chickenpox, it's a really severe disease.